Okay, this is the next episode in my book, Not a Victim, a Survivor: Life Beyond Domestic Violence and Rape. My book is on Amazon in ebook form and paperback. It's the first book in my series, Life Beyond Silence. And I decided to do the podcast pretty recently because I just wanted I think I just wanted to have an avenue that was different. And if you have any questions or comments and you leave them for me, I will do the best I can to answer them. I also wanted to kind of finalize my other two books and hopefully get them as well up on Amazon. And if by listening to my story or reading my story, getting my book and reading it, then I've helped someone, that's great. I just want people to know that have been through or are going through something similar to know they're not the only one, they're not alone, and you can survive. I'm much older now, and I've learned a lot. I have a lot of regrets and things I wish I could take back, but you can't. And you just have to get up every day, and you just have to try to make peace with what you have been through and what you've done. I know I made a lot of bad mistakes. And I know I'm also a lot older now. And there's really nothing I can do or say that will ever make things right with a lot of people. But I'm still here, and I'm trying. Every single day, I get up and I go forward. You have to. You have to. Mainly in order to survive, you have to just move forward and try to make peace. Okay, let's get into the next episode. God only knows how I felt then and how I feel now. My heart had been broken, and yet I still continued to drag myself from my sleep, take care of my home, my kids, cook dinner, and even do laundry. If it weren't for that, I would have vanished, disappeared, crumbled, possibly even blown away, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, to top everything off, my ex-husband found out about what Phil did, just as I had foreseen. I received some legal papers from his attorney that he wanted custody of my first daughter. As I said, I used names in the book, but in the podcast, I've decided just to use initials for my children. because I just didn't want them to drag them into my podcast. I'm not even for sure they're aware that I'm doing a podcast. Not surprising to me, however, they read that I was an unfit mother, that this was an unfit household, and custody should be changed. All I could think was, God, someone hand me a gun and I'll shoot myself. No, I'll shoot someone else. Can you guess who? Would have been my first on the list. Matt, even after all these years, was definitely predictable. After all, here was his best chance to get me after all these years. It was like he was getting revenge. He's tried to get her away from me for years, and now he finally has the right ammunition. And that's true. After dragging me back and forth to court for so many years over everything, me cutting her hair, me being 15 minutes late, late for like him taking visitation of her. It was like every single thing I did. Like when I went to Germany and he was trying to say I couldn't take her out of the country. When the judge said, yeah, she can take her out of the country, and if you want to see your daughter, you can have her the whole summer. But you go get her, and then she'll have to fly back to the States and pick her up before school starts. He never used that right. Never once. Because he never really wanted my first daughter. He just wanted to get revenge at me. I had left him. Just like his first wife, I had left him. And by the time I left him, he was just an alcoholic and a despondent person. We didn't have anything. Nothing. And he was mad. And after all these years of trying to nitpick and just do whatever he could, well, here was his chance. Phil had done something and given him ammunition to take her away from me. I knew he had been jumping for joy at the prospect of hurting me by taking her from me. He had to have been. He didn't care for her. He wasn't really worried about her environment. He just saw an opening to get her and hurt me in the process. Not to mention, he then wouldn't have to pay child support. I called my lawyer, and what he said really upset me. What Phil had done was really bad. Now he was going to truly pay for his mistake. In the eyes of a judge deciding the custody of my daughter, what he had done could be considered horrible and most likely a bad environment for which her to live. He didn't even think we should attempt to fight it out, since my chances were very slim. What he did suggest was divorce. Divorce? Divorce who? Phil? It's the only way to keep your daughter. That's what my lawyer said. Get a divorce and promise never to see him again, and you'll win. After all, you didn't do this. Now the breaking point was at hand. It was either Phil or my first daughter. There was no choice here. This was a nightmare. BD, which is her initials, was my firstborn daughter, and she was only 12 years old. She was my child, and I loved her with all my heart. But now I have to choose between my daughter going to my ex-husband, her father, or my husband, which although he had betrayed my trust, I still loved him, and I wanted to grow with him. This was absolutely killing my soul. God help me. My daughter means the world to me, just as all my kids do. What am I supposed to do? Does Matt get to dictate my future? If I give up on the man in my life for my daughter, what about the next man? Matt will just try again and again and again. What do I have to do? Become a hermit and live my life alone on welfare with 4 children and no man? All because Matt is a desperate, horrid man just out to get me for leaving him years ago? I used to say if BD ever asked to go live with him, I'd never stop her because she deserved to see for herself what kind of man he was. After all, anyone can be a good father on the weekend, but to have him take her away from me this way was so unfair. She'd been with me 12 years. And what of her sisters and brother? Did her being split from her siblings mean so little to everyone? My chances were slim. Matt didn't care for her. He just wanted to hurt me. And finally he had what he needed to do just that. He finally had a knife at which to carve out my heart with. Yes, Phil was to blame for all of this, but it was Matt that I truly hated. Phil had given him the fuel, but it was Matt that had made the fire, and now I was losing my daughter. I just didn't have words. My lawyer thought the easiest thing was to file divorce papers and kick Phil out. At least it would buy us some time in which to think. I did what my lawyer advised. However, one visitation weekend while BD was with Matt, he decided not to bring her home, saying he would retain her until a decision had been reached about custody. So now I was alone with 3 kids, waiting for my time in court. I was going to win the battle, but my choice between Phil or BD said in the end that I was going to lose the war. Phil didn't fight me over the divorce. He said he knew it had been hard on me, and he was extremely sorry. He said he'd wait for me forever if necessary, and he'd help me with money. Most of all, he said his love for me would never die. I remember when we signed our divorce papers, we were holding hands in my lawyer's office. And then while they were being typed up, we went to get something for breakfast. I couldn't stop crying. We held each other in the car, making all kinds of promises. He was the one who I had given my heart to, and the one that I had always dreamed of, and now look at us. I had never gotten a divorce from someone I loved, and believe me, the pain was overpowering. Phil agreed to everything, even the restraints put on him regarding his own son, his own baby. He wouldn't be allowed to come back and see us. He wouldn't have custody. He wouldn't have visitation. He wouldn't have anything. He was told he couldn't see us at all. He couldn't even see his son, since that would look like there was possible contact with BD. I felt everyone was turning their back on Phil. Yes, he had done wrong. He had made mistakes. But now he was not only losing just me and the girls, but he was losing his own son. I remembered the old saying, you made your bed, now lie in it. But now his punishment, was it going to be too great? Was I the only one that could see how wrong this was? I will have to say, I was completely a wreck. You know, I look back at that and realize that things were like in slow motion. I had completely, I guess you would say, been in some kind of shock. Not only had Phil done what he did, and I had gone through that in less than 3 months, both the indecent exposure and the sexual misconduct. But then to have this slapped on me, I was at the end of my rope. I just was going through motions. I still loved Phil. I did. But I could hardly let him touch me. I was still falling apart. And now more than ever, because I was being threatened by my first husband, who after 12 years finally had something. He finally had something to get back at me with. And it was unimaginable to be going through this the way I was, because everybody had kind of accepted that yes, I was married again, that I had just had a baby, that my son was literally 2 years old. And now, because what my husband had done, oh, he was a sexual predator, he was a filthy person, he was disgusting. There was so many comments from my family. And my friends that had once said, well, you know, it's not like he actually committed rape. It's not like he actually did something unforgivable. You should try to make it work. Well, now that this had happened, all my friends had said, are you kidding me? He's a loser. Get rid of him. You have a child. You can't. There's no choice here. You have to choose your child. Now, looking back at my age now, absolutely. If I could go back and make the right decisions in life, I probably, to be honest, just like I had said when he first told me about the indecent exposure, I probably would have just kicked him out then. That's what I should have done. I should have been so disgusted that I kicked him out right then. But I remember how I felt when all of the news first broke, and it started with the indecent exposure. I was just frozen. I was literally walking around as a zombie. I couldn't think. I didn't want him to touch me. I was trying to make sense of it. I was trying to think, do I divorce him? I still love him, but I can't stand for him to touch me. And I want to cry. And I want to kill myself. Why in the world would he do this? And then right behind the indecent exposure came the sexual misconduct with that disgusting woman. And I just thought, if he can come on to her, what does that say about me? Am I so disgusting? Am I so heavy now that I've had my son that he doesn't want to be with me and he's willing to, I don't know, be with somebody like her? And I did. I sat around and I thought about it and I thought about it. And I should have just kicked him to the curb then. Way before I got the papers from my ex. Because I did feel in that moment, especially after the misconduct, I felt like there was going to be something else happen. I felt like my first husband, who had literally been biting at the bit to get to me, to get at me, to do something to me. I just felt like, oh my God, Phil, can you be any stupider? Can you do anything else in this world that's not, I mean, I just felt it. I just felt an overwhelming cloud start to roll in. And I just thought, if Matt finds out, even though Phil's attorney had said, this will go away, it's just going to be trespassing, it'll go away. Well, it didn't. And here Matt was, chomping at the bit. And here my attorney said the wisest thing. This is bad. This is really bad. If it was a big city, you'd have a better chance, because there's people out there doing stuff like this everywhere. And you could throw yourself on the mercy of the court. But it's a small community. Relatively small. And this is going to be big news. This is a person that should not be in the same house with children, especially young girls. Mainly for the indecent exposure, if nothing else. Because that could mean that he would expose himself to your kids. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I called every lawyer I could think of. Like I said just 2 seconds ago. If it was a bigger city, far away from us, something that made sense. We lived in a small city. And a traditional one at that. Since Phil had no prior record and lacked harmful intent, there would have been a better chance for us in a bigger city. The second issue was this must have been intended, or it must have been like, indeed, I should say, some kind of mistake. This should have actually never made it into court in the first place, since it looked like a trumped up charge with no valid source or evidence, just her word against his. All of which I already knew was unfair. He said Phil's lawyer should have never let him get charged with anything, and then my ex would have never had would have had such a much harder time at trying to reverse custody, especially after all these years. Every now and then, Phil and I would meet secretly, just to hold each other and reassure each other of our undying love. But Phil couldn't stay in town very long. He was just finishing out his work. And then he was going to Louisiana because he had family there. My heart was breaking, and the hurt I was going through was almost unbearable. We were both hoping things would eventually work out and we would get back together. When I went to court, they were satisfied that Phil, that horrible, disgusting man, was out of my life. And that bad example was out of the picture. And the judge granted me a stay of custody. BD would be able to stay with me, and although it should have made me happy, I remember crying as I left the courthouse. They never knew him, they didn't know what kind of dad he was, and they were passing judgment. That we, the kids and me, were somehow much better off without him. Don't get me wrong, I was glad about the fact that I would remain the custodial parent of BD, my first daughter. But I felt that I felt that not only had Matt dictated my life, but the judicial system was now saying where I should live, who I should be with. Phil was better than Matt, any day. Matt's alcohol problems outweighed Phil's by a long shot. But I wasn't allowed to bring that up. All they wanted to hear was that Phil was gone. They didn't even care that in doing so they had broken up a small toddler from his biological parent. They had taken a little boy of only 2 years of age from his real dad. I always thought that the courts tried to keep families together, but instead they had just torn mine and his apart without any remorse. It hadn't mattered to them in the least that Phil's charges were dropped. Or, I guess I should say, dropped down to trespassing. Or that he had served out all his time. I suggested that maybe if we went to counseling, after all, that would show our intent on keeping the family together. But my lawyer said no, nobody would care. What really angered me was that if my first daughter had been Phil's and mine, nobody would have ever taken her from me. But because my ex was causing a stink, they thought that my first daughter was in a questionable environment. Did it not matter that I had 3 other children and that they were okay? Was I the only one that saw this as bullshit? I mean, I had a middle daughter. Nobody was trying to take her from me. I had my youngest daughter, and nobody was trying to take her from me. It didn't matter. It was just Matt. Matt being a revengeful and evil person. I felt at least to satisfy any questions they might have as to her environment, they should have let us seek counseling or maybe had our home visited by social services on a regular basis so they wouldn't have uprooted her sisters and her brother, and so they wouldn't lose their dad over my ex's accusations of an unfit home. Fair wasn't a word that I would have applied to my situation. After all, giving up my daughter and keeping Phil wasn't on the table either. I give up Phil, I keep my daughter. My daughter gets to go and stay with her dad, and I have my other 3 husbands. And if they had allowed Phil to stay, my son would have had his dad. Phil left for good, and I had all 4 of my children. No husband, and it looked like I was going to end up on welfare. What choices are these? It's a no-win situation. I keep my daughter, and according to everyone else, I should just go out and find a replacement for Phil, like he was a dog or something. I remember some people said men are like a dime a dozen. You'll find another one, don't worry, you always do. You'll go on welfare, big deal. You'll be single. You can go to bars, and you'll eventually meet someone else. No big deal, don't sweat it. You don't really need a man anyway. Try again. After all, divorce is nothing new to you. The only thing they were forgetting was that I loved him, and it was hard for me to forget someone I loved. Of course, on the other hand, it wasn't easy either. If I let my daughter go live with her dad, who for the past 12 years had insisted he was just as good of a parent as me, and I lost her, who I would have laid down my life for without hesitation. I remember looking at her in the hospital when she was born and saying, "Thank God, you're so beautiful. I love you so much." The one I sat with at the hospital when she had back surgery, praying to God that her body would heal and she wouldn't be crippled. This is what I lose my oldest daughter. My whole body ached. I had nightmares. I was severely depressed. I remember there I was, feeling like a zombie. Doing daily chores meant nothing to me. Suicidal thoughts rang constantly in my head. But then I would just burst into tears, and my other kids, who would then have nothing. I thought of my son, who was so small. He was the only one of my 4 that didn't have the chance to grow up with his real dad. Didn't he deserve to be with his dad? After all, he was only 2. My first daughter had not only me, but also a stepfather, grandparents, her real dad. My second daughter had not only me, but she had a stepfather and grandparents. Furthermore, my first 2 were sisters, but Matt had always thought that my second daughter had not been his, and so she had been adopted by my second husband, who unfortunately never got to see her since our divorce. due to his drug addiction. My third daughter had a stepfather and her real dad, Kyle. But he didn't see her much because he was still in the military. The decision was unthankful to have to choose between my husband and my oldest daughter, not to mention one child's welfare over three others, especially when you don't understand why her welfare is in question in the first place. It was simply all my ex's doings, and who did he think he was to dictate my life? He had always been drunk. He always drank excessively. Furthermore, you definitely couldn't call him a warm and compassionate man. The fact that his estranged biological children over the years, he had two. The ones that when I was married to him were little, they had now grown up and they hardly had anything to do with him anymore. I mean, he definitely wasn't the perfect parent. In fact, he'd even gotten remarried. He had been a cold, uncaring person with little regard for anyone's feelings, but none of that seemed to matter to anyone but me. I had two choices. I had chose my first daughter. At least it gave me time to think. After all, I had to sort it out. I had to go over it and over it. So many scenarios. Phil, BD, me single again. My love for Phil. You can't live your life for your kids. You can't choose your first daughter over Phil, just as you can't choose Phil over your first daughter. What about his son? My son. Phil is his daddy, and my son would never see his daddy, all because of my ex-husband. My thoughts raced constantly. Not to mention my son was the spitting image of Phil. I could just see in him every day when I looked at him. And I thought about when he would end up being like a football player and a young man and going to see Matt in his old age just to punch him in the face for hurting him and denying him his father. Phil had made some bad mistakes, but he was a good dad and a good husband. I couldn't see any need for him in paying the ultimate price for his mistakes and having to walk away from his family for the rest of his life. I thought of living my life alone, and when me and my daughter sat down and talked, I thought of her getting older and me trying to find Phil. But what then? It would be impossible to think he wouldn't find another woman. A mother would gladly jump in front of a truck, fight off an intruder, walk miles through the Sahara Desert for her daughter. But I still couldn't choose which child's needs were greater, my son's or my oldest. How do you choose your husband over one of your children? Matt had to be extremely happy for putting me through this torment. He had to know how much hurt he was inflicting and loving every minute of it. Maybe on his deathbed, I would get the chance to tell him how much it would mean to me to see him gone from this earth, and then tell him that I had waited a lifetime to look in his eyes and tell him of my hate for him. Revenge would be sweet in the end. I felt like I was dreaming, though. After all, he has said so many times that he would walk on my grave someday and spit on my headstone. Not to mention, I thought my death was most surely come before his. I feel as though I'm swimming against a current and drowning is inevitable. Maybe I'm not meant to be happy. Maybe life does stop here for me. God, please let me sleep. Please. I remember every minute of this. I was depressed, tormented. I was alone. I had my children with me. And my mind just wouldn't stop. Phil would call me every now and then and say things that I wanted to hear, like he loved me, and he would wait. But I was terrified. All I could do was look at my son. All I could do was look at my daughter. And every time she left with Matt for a visit, oh, I cried. I crumbled. Because it was like Matt got what he wanted. He tore me apart. He didn't get my daughter, but he knew he had ruined my life. And he was loving it. And I was hating life every single day. And my family, I look at it now and I think, why didn't my family, they knew that Matt was gone, that Phil was gone. They knew that I had won against Matt. And they knew I was crumbling, that I was depressed, that I was sad, that I was upset. They knew all that. They just jumped on the wagon and they said, he's no good, he's a predator, he's disgusting, we're glad he's gone, you'll find someone else. Don't worry, you make mistakes all the time. Just another mistake. Yep, it was a mistake. And here I was falling apart and nobody was there. Just me with my mind racing constantly. That's all I had. And for someone that is falling apart and walking around like a zombie, was this ever going to end well? I don't know. I remember thinking, I didn't think there was anything that was going to end well for me. Okay, I'm going to quit now. I will say it again. I always go long on my podcast, and I don't mean to. So I will talk to you next time. Thank you.